It's funny how for years the only true scramblers that have been available in India have been expensive big bikes. But now in a span of 3 months we have two legitimate options available. The new Yezdi Scrambler and the new Royal Enfield Scram 411. But before we go ahead, there's been quite a lot of chatter happening online about how this is a quick knee-jerk reaction from Royal Enfield as a rival to the new Yezdi. People, that's not how the auto industry works. A brand new motorcycle takes a minimum of 3 to 4 years to get ready for the market. And even a relatively lighter engineering effort like this still takes quite a lot of time. Royal Enfield actually started working on this project in 2019 before anyone was even thinking about these new Yezdi motorcycles. Of course, the bike did get delayed for obvious reasons. Anyway, perhaps a good way to begin this is by answering the question, what is a scrambler in the first place? Well, you will find plenty of interesting historical explanations on the internet. But in short, these are street motorcycles that also have some credible level of off-road capability. These bikes tend to have clean, minimal designs that echo both their on-road and off-road intentions. And that's why you'll see that both keep it simple without any big windscreens or substantial bodywork. One thing that should be pointed out is that the Scram is heavily based on the Royal Enfield Himalayan. But Yezdi has gone to great lengths to differentiate the Scrambler from its siblings, and kudos to them for doing so. The Royal Enfield Himalayan has always been a slightly oddball and quirky looking motorcycle, and the Scram does look a little more proportionate simply because its headlamp is positioned a little lower. But overall, this shape is very familiar. The Yezdi, on the other hand, well, this is a much more traditionally attractive looking design. And while I still can't understand whether I'm okay with the shape of this seat or not, overall, most people will find this to be the more handsome machine. However, things change when you start taking a closer look. When it comes to quality and finish, the Royal Enfield Scram isn't as nicely detailed as the new Classic and Meteor 350, but the overall finish is quite clean with good quality fasteners used all over. The only thing that caught our attention on the Scram was the patchy finish on the back of the exhaust. It's not an area that most will ever notice, but if you do look there, it's not a pretty sight. Unfortunately, the Yezdi leaves a lot to be desired in terms of quality and finish. While the overall attention to detail could be much nicer, our bike came to us with less than 1,000 kilometers on the clock, and it already had corrosion in places, including one section on the chassis where the black paint had come off and rust was already starting to form. Another issue presented itself in the form of the screw for the clutch lever assembly that would repeatedly come loose on our bike because the nut at the bottom fell off at some point. Making up some ground for the Yezdi is the fact that it has more features than the Enfield. Perhaps the most valuable one is that the Yezdi allows you to switch off the ABS at the rear or put it into a more sensitive rain mode, whereas with the Enfield, you simply have a non-switchable dual-channel system. The Yezdi also comes with very conveniently placed USB Type-A and Type-C charging ports, which is a helpful touch. Potential customers will also get excited by the fact that this bike has an LED headlamp, but we actually found the halogen unit on the Enfield was much nicer to use at night. They both get smart-looking offset instrument consoles with gear position indicators and basic trip data, but the Yezdi's is quite hard to read in direct sunlight. The bikes you see here have some accessories on them. In the Scram's case, the tripper navigation display on the side of the main console needs to be specified as an option when you buy the bike. With the Yezdi, the headlamp grille, small fly screen, engine guards and the handguards are all accessories, and here too, the quality needs to improve, especially in the handguards. Now let's get to the bit you really want to hear about. The Yezdi has the more modern engine. It's liquid cooled, it has a 4-valve head and a 6-speed transmission. Whereas the Scram keeps things relatively simple. It uses the same air and oil cooled motor from the Himalayan and it has the same 5-speed gearbox. The Yezdi has a 5 horsepower advantage, and in this segment that is quite a lot. So now you probably really want to know if the Yezdi's advantage on paper translates to out in the real world. Well, we tested both bikes back to back to find out. Short answer, yes, the Yezdi is noticeably quicker and in every measurable way, be it 0 to 60, 0 to 100 and even in roll-on acceleration. The longer answer, however, is that this performance comes with its compromises. When we first rode the Yezdi a month back, it was for a short duration and mostly at high speeds. Having now ridden it in the city, its low speed fueling and throttle response feels inconsistent, and that makes it hard to ride smoothly in bumper to bumper traffic. We also found that it doesn't like early morning cold starts, and the engine cuts out repeatedly until it's warmed up. And as we previously reported, the refinement within this engine needs to improve because it sounds and feels rough when you rev it out, and that's what you need to do if you want to access all the performance. The Royal Enfield Scram is a very different experience. There is no escaping the fact that this bike leaves you wishing for more performance, but it makes up for that to some extent with very good refinement. The Enfield's easily accessible torque and smooth fueling also makes it much easier and nicer to ride when you aren't going flat out. You're almost always in a higher gear on the Scram than you would be on the Yezdi, and that, along with a lower power figure, helps it to consume less fuel as well. In fact, the Yezdi returned surprisingly low numbers when we tested both bikes back to back. On the highway, both motorcycles can hold a steady 100 kph cruise without effort, but again, the Enfield feels smoother while the Yezdi has more performance in reserve. In the city, both have moderately heavy clutch levers and both produce some noticeable heat, but neither gets overwhelming. So the Yezdi is definitely quicker in a straight line, while the Scram is most certainly nicer to ride at a relaxed pace. But what about the way these bikes can handle our shabby roads? Now, most customers buying something like this are bound to expect a good road bike, but more importantly, something that can handle broken, bumpy roads with effortless ease while keeping the rider in good comfort. How do they do in that regard? Suspension comfort is going to be an important factor in this segment, and the Yezdi doesn't do very well here. As we reported earlier, the suspension is quite firm, almost to the point of being harsh, and this will put off some buyers. Reducing the preload on the Yezdi's rear dual shocks helps quite a bit, but it's still not as good as the Enfield. While the Scram also feels slightly firm at the rear, it is almost plush in comparison, and it has the more comfortable seat as well. As for handling, the firmer Yezdi feels more responsive and engaging in the corners, but eventually both bikes do start to develop a mild weave and wallow if you push them close to the limit. The Yezdi also does a better job with braking because the Scram's front brake is disappointingly dull and it needs a lot of effort for quick stops. Clearly, these two are not exciting and sporty cornering machines, but they are quite decently capable, and that's a factor that remains when you take them onto rougher terrain as well. Now let's get to off-road riding, and that's where things get interesting between these two. But before we go there, there is something we need to address, and that's weight. The Scram is based on the Royal Enfield Himalayan, which is well known to be a heavy motorcycle. This one is slightly lighter, but it still weighs 194 kilos with the optional main stand and about 192 without it. Now, if you were to go over to Yezdi's website, you'll see that the company lists weight as 182 kgs, which is significantly lower than that bike. However, the company isn't being completely transparent here because that figure does not account for the weight of fuel. With a 12-litre tank full, this bike weighs pretty much the same as that one. And that means that both these bikes are heavier than we'd have liked. Thankfully, both have a good 200 mm of ground clearance, but as has become the theme of this story, both have their advantages and drawbacks. The Scram suspension is better off-road as well, and it not only has more travel than the Yezdi, but it also feels better damped and more absorptive. The Scram's generous torque and smooth throttle makes it easier to manage tight maneuvers at slow speeds, and the bike definitely feels more comfortable and encouraging to ride in the dirt. The downsides are that it just doesn't have the grunt that you'd sometimes want, and it's impossible to turn off the rear ABS without pulling out a fuse and deactivating the whole system. Both those things make the Scram more suited to calmly exploring some off-road surroundings rather than riding it fast and aggressively. On the other hand, the Yezdi's extra hit of performance and its switchable rear ABS make it more of a fun hooligan, but it doesn't have the same ease, composure and confidence of the Enfield. Moreover, the relatively limited rear suspension travel means that it bottoms out more easily, especially if you have reduced the preload for some more comfort on the road. Despite having the same claimed ground clearance, the Yezdi also tended to scrape its engine bash guard more often. Tall riders will find the Yezdi's standing ergonomics a bit cramped, but short riders will appreciate that neither bike has a very tall seat. Ultimately, these two have a pretty decent amount of off-road ability, but if that's a high priority for you, then the adventure siblings of both these motorcycles will prove to be more capable and better equipped for not a lot more money. We've been riding these two bikes for the past few days over many hundreds of kilometers, and I really have been thinking about how the conclusion to this comparison falls into place. They do have some nice things to offer, but ultimately, I can't shake the feeling of being slightly underwhelmed by both these motorcycles. Prices will play no role in deciding between these two because both bikes cost almost exactly the same. So let's begin the conclusion by addressing the newer bike here. The Scram 411 shows just how much Royal Enfield has improved the performance, quality and refinement of the original Himalayan over the past 6 years. At the same time, I think it also highlights the company has taken this platform as far as it can go, and the bike now deserves more performance, better brakes, less weight and fresh style. Happily, a brand new next generation Himalayan has just been spotted testing, and it promises all of those things. As for the Yezdi, it's a good looking motorcycle, it has a nice level of features and it is quite quick. Unfortunately, the bike comes across as a little crude and unrefined, both in the way it's put together and in how the engine performs. There is a lot of scope for improvement here. If you've narrowed it down to these two bikes, choosing between them comes down to what you want to prioritize and what you're willing to sacrifice. That is a deeply personal decision. As for me, well, I've been on the road for 5 days now. It's been hot, I'm tired, and I just want an easy, effortless and comfortable bike to ride home. I know what I'm going to be taking. It's still 10 times better than I rely on.
Why don't you just take off the cover prior to your ride and just shove it somewhere?
This is why we need to be more healthy and wear the appropriate gear. Hey, you're enjoying the air conditioning, aren't you?